Welcome to Notes to My Legal Self. Together, we explore topics of interest to in-house lawyers. Let's begin. Here's your host, Olga Mack.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Notes to My Legal Self. I am really excited to have this conversation. And today I have a special and repeat guest, Carolyn. And without further ado, welcome to Notes to My Legal Self. Again, for those folks who haven't met you before, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Thank you for having me back. It's always nice to have a conversation with you. My name is Carolyn Herzog, and I'm the Chief Legal Officer and Corporate Secretary for Elastic, which is a Dutch headquartered company. We are the search AI company. We're traded on the New York Stock Exchange.
Really cool. So to situate us in your journey, I want to have this conversation about optimism and turbulence and things that are happening in the world. Very deep conversation. But before we go there, to make sure that folks have context about your background, how did you get to be a fearless legal leader at a top AI company? What happened before?
So much. It's a long history. And one of the things I often share is that I'm one of those lawyers that actually never intended to be a lawyer. I was a liberal arts major. I was a French and music major. When I graduated from college, I went to Washington, D.C., and was very fortunate to get a job working at the World Bank in the African department. And so for me, a driving factor has always been international. Everything that is a global environment, an international environment, working with people from different cultures, that's really motivating to me. I eventually went to law school thinking I needed a serious graduate degree to think about what I was doing next, but thought that I might stay in government or with NGOs. Maybe I'd work at the UN. And in fact, my first job out of law school was working for a nonprofit that was partially funded by the World Bank, and it worked on legal reform projects. And I think my career has been a series of luck and accidents and working with great people. So the cultural aspects and working with great people are really what led me to where I am today. I've worked with people that saw things in me that maybe I didn't see in myself, that kept me motivated and interested and engaged. And I think it's a big difference. It's certainly something I hope for my kids, that they meet people that encourage them to learn and to work outside their comfort zone. So I never worked in a law firm. I've only worked in-house, and it's through meeting people and being interested in what I was doing.
Yeah, I love your past, and I love that you only worked in-house, and it definitely shaped your perspective in many ways. And I know you've been the serial general counsel at a few companies, leading companies through all kinds of things, from AI changes to changes in the world. I'm just curious, from your perspective, what has been the most memorable change that you led folks through?
Gosh, it is hard to pick a most memorable because there have been a few bumps in the road. And I think probably the most memorable was what I can't say it's memorable because it's happening right now, but the change that's happening with AI is something that I think we'll all look back on and say, gosh, that was pretty crazy. Beyond that, the most memorable to date is COVID. It was something that was shared across the world, that it didn't matter what industry you were in. We were all dealing with a crisis at the same time. And it really, I don't think I'd be working from home in an office at home if COVID hadn't struck. So it changes the way we work, the way that we communicate, the way that we connect with people. I think it forced us to be more empathetic to the real challenges that people could face on a daily basis. And it made it more open, certainly in the legal industry, where perhaps historically we aimed for perfection and you weren't really allowed to show weakness. It made us all vulnerable at the same time, regardless of what profession we were in.
Very interesting. I love that. Two things that come to your mind is one, AI today, and COVID a few years ago. And I'm just curious, as we've gone through COVID and reconstruction post it, I'm just curious if you were to reflect on what happened and the reconstruction that I think is still ongoing, but we're now faced with a new challenge. On balance, how would you rate us to come out? How do you think we came out as individuals, as lawyers, as society? And how did we do?
It's a big question. So I have two children. One is 23 and one is 21. And I think about it from a societal perspective a little bit through their eyes. Unlike other things that may have happened in my lifetime that may have been really hard, I don't think it fundamentally changed the way I see the world. And for my kids, and certainly when I speak with others who had kids that were, we'll say, of a social impact kind of age, it has impacted our children in a dramatic way. One, because they interrupted their learning and their social activity. Two, because they suddenly became engrossed in social media. And we're only realizing now, gosh, how do we get our news? How do we find out what is truth and what is fiction? How do we get information from diverse perspectives to try and land on what we think about an issue? And how do we respond to traumatic events and help people through so that they have that confidence and the social construct to be able to engage in a human way? Even me, I'm quite an extrovert. And I have found post-COVID that I get more exhausted in large environments where there's loads of people. I'm very conscious of somebody sneezing next to me. It has changed my perspective of what it's like to be out in the world.
Yeah, as an introvert, I've become a lot more sober about how much I want to be in the world, just generally post-COVID, because I have seen the contrast of the cost that I was unseen. Just curious, you and I talked a little bit about the importance of optimism as a leader, whether you're building or growing or scaling or winding things down. It helps the teams to go forward and do the mission and complete the mission and get things done. I'm curious, what is your thoughts on the presence of that optimism, say during something like COVID, when some folks are dying because there's this virus going around, or things that are going today? Yes, there's AI and there's a lot of anxiety around, will I have the job tomorrow? Will I have the same standard of living? Will it be better? Will it be worse? And then, of course, there's a few wars all over the world, and one way or another, folks are going to be affected, whether because they know somebody who's affected or they're calculated distance between themselves and a country that may have nukes. And what are the chances of being hit? I now have had a few conversations about that, something that I always thought of, something my parents and grandparents used to talk about, and was becoming, was the old generation that talked about it, but now we're talking about it. So I'm curious, let's talk about this thing of optimism when you have viruses, changes in technology, and wars.
Particularly as a lawyer, right, and being a legal professional, I think we have to have a pretty healthy sense of paranoia, I'll say, maybe over pessimism. Pessimism doesn't really serve you to achieve things. As a leader, I think it is really important to be optimistic and to show that there is a way that we can get through things. There is a vision, and to have that clarity. And then when you put on your legal hat, I think it's really important to have also a healthy sense of paranoia. We think about all the things that could go wrong. And was it Mike Tyson that said that everybody, has a plan until they get punched in the face? I'm not sure if that was the exact quote, but it's something akin to that for me, it's about preparedness. I worked in cybersecurity almost my entire career. And working in cyber, there is always a crisis. There is always an incident, whether it's in your own company or one of your customers. And there's always something new and changing. Often in technology, or people that work in the technology field, they say it's not about being adaptable to change. It's about perhaps being a little bit addicted to that. And having a healthy sense of optimism that you know how to get through it, you know where you're going, you know how to bring people along, is really critical. And when you're a leader and you're encouraging people to follow a vision, it's really important to be optimistic about that vision. At the same time, it needs to be realistic. It needs to be clear. You need to know what are the potential barriers and the hurdles that you're going to have to get around to achieve your goals. And you have to be really open to feedback in the moment and have that ability to pivot if something isn't working. It's all about that learning from mistakes, but creating that safe environment and making sure that you're hearing about the concerns that people have, as well as their ambitions and the things that people want to achieve. Maybe there's some potential that you haven't identified, and you need to be open to being able to pivot to achieve that new potential. Things are changing all the time.
Yeah. So let's maybe talk specifically about the plan and execution of that in the age of AI. Yeah. I'm sure you've heard from your colleagues and reports and peers concerns, whether they're explicitly acknowledging them or not, or implying, worrying about being ready one way or another, what's coming, whether they have enough skills, whether they still even have a job. And I'm just curious, how do you think about this new technology? And now it's actually not so new anymore. It's been here for a few years. It's been around in some form for a number of years, in this form for about a few years. And I'm curious, how do you have conversations with your team? How do you prepare yourself? How do you have conversations with your peers?
Yeah. So first, artificial intelligence has existed for decades. What has changed in the last few years is generative AI. So that ability for AI to really start learning in a human way and interacting with humans in a more regular way. And it's changing the way we process. It's changing the velocity of the work that we do. It's changing, if you go back to the social media questions before, how are we getting information and making decisions based on that information? And it's changing our career trajectories in a very dramatic way. Similar to, I think back to in the technology sense again, as we were transforming from on-premise technology using a software tool on your network within your company to cloud. With cloud, we saw that it was coming. We saw the changes that were happening. It had existed for some time, but it was changing the way that consumers and enterprises worked with technology. So what did we do? We started a plan. We had a group of people who would come together cross-functionally and say, a year from now, we're going to have transitioned X amount of work to the cloud, and here's how we're going to do it. With artificial intelligence, or specifically generative AI, it happened yesterday. And we are now, I think what makes people more concerned and more paranoid now is not only the capabilities of artificial intelligence and generative AI and agentic AI and AI basically making decisions for us or getting us the information based on which we have to make decisions quickly. It's already happened. And so we don't have the time to plan, and we need to be extremely organized around how are we prioritizing our workloads? How are we changing the way that we work? What are those boundaries and parameters that we need people to think about to guard their behavior in terms of how they're using AI as a consumer or within our companies as an enterprise?
And so what are the sort of practical tools and balance of risk and rewards of AI that you invite folks in those conversations to think about?
So I think about it in a few pillars, first of all. And one is, as legal advisors, how are we advising the company to implement with velocity artificial intelligence? All companies now that I'm aware of are pushing artificial intelligence and saying we need to get on this bandwagon, with a few exceptions of those that are being more conservative. And there will be winners and losers in terms of how AI is being implemented. There will be mistakes that will be made, but that piece around how are we advising our company to use AI in a responsible way. And frankly, the responsibility factor, because we're using responsibility as the newer term, not much has changed with generative AI from how we were talking about AI responsibility or AI ethics 10 years ago, except that we're talking about the use of IP more succinctly with generative AI. How are we making sure that the intellectual property that's coming in can be owned by the company and used by the company in a way and pushed out into the universe in a responsible and compliant way. But when we talk about the pillars of responsibility overall, we've been talking about privacy and security, and I think of those more and more together. I think that you cannot have privacy without security. We used to talk about adequate security, but now it's an evolving landscape of standards around what security is important and necessary for the implementation of certain technologies. So privacy and security, addressing both illegal and unfair bias in the machine, and obviously bias and how we talk about diversity and inclusion these days is something that's evolving and changing. But I think about it both from a pure legal, is it compliant perspective, as well as is it ethical? Is it the way you can have bias in the machine? It's okay to direct bias as long as it's not unfair or illegal. And then we think about the future of jobs, right? And what's happening with all of our jobs and how are we using AI within the legal team?
Yeah, sometimes because when you have so much change, you start accepting things, you change in such small increments that it becomes natural. So I guess maybe the question I'll ask you is, what kind of risk are we legal teams knowingly or unknowingly accept today that you may not have accepted, or other legal teams in the past? Or maybe the other way around, that we're more likely to accept. Because usually with change, what also changes is a threshold of acceptability of risk.
Yeah.
And you gave a couple of examples. And because those changes are incremental, they sometimes become natural lowering or increasing of thresholds. So I'm curious if you had an opportunity to think about it, and where do you see that lowering or increase happen?
Yeah. So, I mean, generative AI really first hit the scene and we were seeing what ChatGPT could do. I'm recalling my brother, who is a professor at a university, actually the university that I went to undergraduate. And he's a scientist. And I said, how are you addressing this in your classroom? Are you allowing your students to use artificial intelligence? And he said, absolutely not. It's banned. I've told them they can't use it. I think in the past, from a legal perspective, we would have approached this unknown entity and looked at the risks associated with it. And we would have tried to draw a hard line until we understood what the impact was and we could provide guidance. We would have just said, no, that's not possible with artificial intelligence. The metaphors are the horse has already left the barn. It is already off the runway. And so it is not realistic for anybody to say no. What we need to do is guide and really look at not just the technology itself, but have a manner of evaluating the technology and make sure that people are on board, that they're on board from an IT perspective, from an engineering perspective, that leaders understand what are the rewards that we're trying to gain and what are the risks associated with that. And then there's certain hard parameters that we have to say from a use case perspective or an application, these are the risks that we agree as a leadership team are not worth it for the company. We can't just speak in a pure legal perspective. There are certain laws and rules that you don't cross, like in religion, like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not use artificial intelligence to launch nuclear weapons. Most of us are not in that business, thankfully. But if you think about hiring practices, for instance, using artificial intelligence from an agentic perspective to make decisions on hiring is broadly a no-no. That's just not a good idea. But you have to agree with that and understand, what is our HR organization trying to accomplish? What do we want to do to help them with velocity? Do we all understand and accept that's a risk that we're not willing to take? And so bringing people along and having those important conversations and then simplifying the intake. I often say, years ago, I was consulting with others around how are you implementing AI and the checks and balances for the intake of AI tools with, for instance, your information security or data privacy requirements. You can't go back and ask engineers or IT people to fill in 3 different questionnaires. You need to have one operational question, one questionnaire that asks the question once around what are you using this information for? Are you planning to be transparent about that? Are you going to use it in any other ways? Is there a risk of that? And how do you manage the checks and balances to get back to the answers and make sure that the answers are factual and correct at the time?
Yeah, the impact on HR is actually, I think, is doesn't feel as dramatic as nukes, but very important in every single person's life that you know of, and therefore very important and dramatic. What I find in conversations about impact of AI, the differentiation between assistive versus decision making, which I think what you're trying to get to, I would say, was an HR example. Does it just help you sort through noise, or is that actually making your decision? I'm curious, do you find that distinction practical, sort of in practice? Like how easy, at what point that line is blurred? And is there a bright line test? How do you know you crossed it? Or is this sort of a heuristic that we like to lean into, but really increasingly doesn't have a whole lot of meaning because it's really hard to tell? At what point does assistance become decision making, right? At what point assistance actually colors your judgment and leads to unavoidable outcomes? So I'm curious how you think about it.
So more and more we're thinking about self-service with artificial intelligence, or just in our legal processes in general. So I'll use an example for an easy one. When you think about low risk areas, there's really no reason not to have a self-service NDA. There's only so many answers that you're going to get to and that you can fill in the blank on, and there's no reason not to have an artificial intelligence or an automated tool dropping down options and allowing for choices within 3 good options. And you could apply that to a number of different scenarios where you start wanting to get a human in the loop, having that human oversight, as is required by the EU AI Act and other state regulatory requirements, is around the high risk. So we're talking more these days about risk and reward. That's where you started with the conversation around AI. And I think we all need to think about that in terms of the impact. If the risk is high, you need to make sure you have a human in the loop making the decision. That human needs to be able to rely on the information and make sure that it's not hallucinating or giving them incorrect information on which to make their decision. And so you have automation and self-service where you don't need a human in the loop for things that are low risk, easy reward. For things that are high reward, high risk, you need to have a human making decisions, but a human that is making decisions based on reliable, factual information.
Yeah, very interesting. I like how you broke it down into high risks and rewards and ranking that. I'm curious, when you look at what breaks down in legal function when AI adoption exceeds governance, which is I think what you're alluding to, what breaks first? What doesn't work? What is a sign that adoption is much more ahead of governance?
That's a really good question. So I would say, I don't think there's any place that I'm experienced right now where adoption is ahead of governance, although we've seen it in the news. We've seen it where outside counsel has gone to court and relied on legal research that may have been inaccurate. So we've seen the dramatic news stories of somebody that relied on precedents that didn't exist. AI was making it up. So that's a high risk kind of environment where somebody didn't do their due diligence. In the in-house environment, the way that we're thinking about it is very systematically. Right now, if I were an external counsel, I would be thinking very hard about how I'm serving my in-house clients, because in-house clients are going to start to do more research internally with more reliable tools. And there's a number of tools that are out there that don't have the hallucination issue that we may have seen in some of those court cases, and can allow us to make judgment calls based on our own internal research faster. When I think back, and I often cited this, like when I started in my career, I would write to outside counsel. I would ask them for their opinion on an area of law, and they might send me a memo. I might even get one in the mail. It might even like paper copies of opinions so that I could tuck that away. That is way too slow. So for me, it's not just about the use case, but it's about how quickly we are moving. My prediction is not that we're going to be out of jobs, but that we're going to have to learn how to do our jobs much faster. And doing things too quickly without the right information leads to mistakes.
Yeah, I think you're right. Practically speaking, what I'm noticing is that as we go through various changes in turbulence, we see that actually land in our contracts. So for example, as you probably recall, during COVID, we had about lots of conversation about acts of God demand, for example. And then as AI has been coming into our lives, what we've seen is lots of governance is actually in the contract. A lot of obligations, a lot of audit provisions, a lot of basically governance. It was basically landing and reshaping, and it still is very actively the landscape of contracting. And this is where I would like to talk about the sort of numerous geopolitical adventures we have in the world, wars and threats and tariffs and all kinds of things. And I'm curious, how does that impact contracting? Because contracting is the first tool that it's a bridge between us and another company, and in the highly uncertain world. And so contracts tend to be the first place to absorb a lot of these things. Do you see the same for geopolitical events as we have seen for AI and COVID, for example? Or is that absorbed somewhere else?
So I guess I haven't really thought about geopolitical events impacting contracting, except for in certain specific areas around, for instance, public sector contracting. Where it does impact is around policy and perception. And as we look at greater uncertainty in the geopolitical market, as we look at our relationships with allies and the issues of impacting tariffs unfortunately have not impacted my area of business as much as those that are working in hardware, but it does impact the costs for our customers in other areas that may impact their contract relationships with us. To me, contracts are really about the relationship. If you think about it like a marriage contract, it's something that defines how you want your relationship to work, and you hope you don't have to rely on the contract in areas where you might have a dispute or disagreement later. So you want contracts to run smoothly. You want them to be a reflection of, if you remember back in law school, I'm selling you an apple and you want to give me 3 oranges, that's not necessarily the equivalent for one person where it could be more valuable for another. So you have to have it as a reflection of an agreement between parties around what you're expecting from the relationship. And that should help things run more smoothly. But contracts, we know, can easily be broken. And we know that geopolitical events or force majeure events can impact whether or not you can enforce that contract. There's also just how laws are enforced generally between countries. So the international issues are very important. What I'm seeing as a result of maybe artificial intelligence, geopolitical events, is more of a drive towards sovereignty and more nationalistic tendencies. We've been working through a world that has become increasingly global, and everything was becoming closer together, and it was easy to think about cross-border transfers. GDPR really changed the way that we were thinking about how to protect the information that's transferring in a digital age. Today, we are seeing more of a push towards, how do I control that information? How do I bring it back to keep it only in my environment, only in my private cloud, only in my country? And that is changing somewhat the contractual relationships. The other thing that I see as a trend is that there's so much uncertainty with artificial intelligence, including from a regulatory landscape, that many companies are saying, I want to be protective against the future, and therefore I'm going to put in contractual terms that I think will protect me for where this is going. And most companies can't comply with that fear and uncertainty in the market.
Yeah. I'm just curious because one way or another, what ends up happening in executive conversations, discussions around exits, market shifts, supply chain, data localization, all the things you just mentioned, responding to various regulations one way or another. So as counsels, as legal leaders, how do we shape that conversation in this age of high uncertainty with some level of optimism, with some level of healthy skepticism as we go through turbulence in a way that allows us not just survive, but to thrive?
To me, it all comes back to that magical word trust. We want to be trusted advisors to our business partners in the company. And companies want to be the trusted vendor for their customers. So if you start with the premise that we want to be trusted, and then you think about how do you build and retain trust, it's about doing what you say you're going to do, about listening to people's interests and making sure that you're seeking to understand. And ultimately, the companies that win are those that are going to differentiate themselves in the market by being that trusted vendor, being that resource that companies continue to think, I need this, and I trust this company to deliver, and being able to adapt to changes in the market as well.
Yeah, I love that you came back to trust, one of my favorite words these days. Definitely, we know that allows to streamline commerce a whole lot more when there is trust among parties. And obviously, also internal conversations go much better if there is trust among the on the executive team. As you're thinking about helping your team, you'll say legal team, and maybe folks across your company to manage their lives, their careers, their well-being, their mental health around the turbulence that is around them, whether it's AI or geopolitical events of a sort, or all the learning they have to do, adjustments, say, in contracting policies, governance. I can go on for a long time. How do you help them deal with all that turbulence and go forward and position themselves for the better tomorrow?
So one aspect is just having that comfort and that trust within your own team to be able to express when you're having a difficult time. I think earlier, when I think back to the beginning of my career, I really felt like I needed to be in the office. I needed to be there 14 hours a day. I needed to show that I was always available no matter what. And when you're working in a more virtual environment, being available no matter what, I started working before we had cell phones. That can be a very different scenario. And when you're working from home in particular, you have to be able to turn off sometimes when work is always available. So I think creating that safe environment where people know that you expect them to be accountable, you expect them to be professional. And what does it mean to be a professional? It means that you don't take things personally. You're willing to listen. You're willing to learn. You're willing to understand that maybe somebody had different expectations. It's building that trust internally. And with trust and accountability, that can do and say do, you give yourself that permission to also say, I'm taking my kid to soccer practice at 3 p.m. when they get off of school, but I will be back available at 4 p.m. And if there's an emergency, here's my phone number and you can text me. Enabling people to be the accountable professionals that we all know they are and can be. And that also means with that, giving them permission to say, I'm not available at certain times. I used to joke in a global team environment, you have very different attitudes on what that means from an American perspective versus a French perspective versus a Japanese perspective. People have certain concepts around what it means to be available. And I was always impressed by the French team. I think it's the OECD that publishes this report every year about the most productive countries. And France shows up as one of the highest. And yet when we think about the French and how good they are, I'm gone for August, but you can call me in September. It doesn't equate to what an American would think about as being responsible and accountable. But the reality is when you set that expectation on when you're taking your lunch break, when you're going to pick up your kids, when you're going to be available and not available. And when you say you're available, you are truly available. And when there's something that's urgent, you will truly respond. That creates trust. And we need to change our mindset on a global basis to build that accountability and that responsibility, that sense of being a professional at all times.
Yeah. I was laughing when you gave that example. That's a really good example. We're coming to the end. I do have a couple of questions. One is around this word resilience. You mentioned the word trust, but resilience is another one. When you talk about turbulence and optimism and healthy skepticism, I think the definition of what resilient team looks like may be changing, maybe not. I'm just curious, what do you think? What do you see around legal teams? What does a resilient team 3 to 5 years from now look like? And is it the same as it is today, or is it perhaps a little different?
I think it is changing. I think we are now dealing with an unprecedented amount of change. And we used to differentiate a little bit between what is change management versus what is transformation, right? A transformation is when a company is being acquired or you're moving from on-premise to cloud. AI is transforming completely the way that we work and the way that we practice and provide legal services to our internal customers. So getting a mindset shift, there's the Carol Dweck theories around and training around mindset shift. This is a completely different mindset shift. If you are a newer attorney and coming into practice, you're practicing in a vastly different way than when I started practicing. And so how do we change the way that we are advising? How do we change the rapidity in which we provide answers to our internal customers? How do we look at risk in a more cohesive way and bring people along for that journey? I'll often say there's early adopters and then there's lawyers, right? And when my television had 4 remotes, suddenly I didn't know how to work it anymore. I was not, even though I worked in technology my entire career, that doesn't mean I am tech savvy. And as a profession, we need to be much more tech savvy. We need to be really intimately comfortable with artificial intelligence and how we are using it on a day-to-day basis. And there's a number of use cases. It may vary somewhat between teams, but we're going to be using, we used to pay our outside counsel a lot of money for due diligence. We're going to have to start thinking about how do we bring that in-house? What are we doing? And how do we manage the risks associated with that? So we're learning new skills. There is so much opportunity to learn new skills and to think about practicing for the future. There is going to be a load of mistakes that people will make along the way. But I think leaning on each other, learning from each other, building the in-house practice of the future means being adaptable. We would set a goal, and that goal was the goal for the year. Right now, in the age of artificial intelligence, we need to be, not that we still need the direction and the vision for how we're going to move with velocity towards a goal, but we need to be able to pivot much faster.
Yeah, for sure. I agree with you that there's going to be a lot more observed in-house as you have tools that allow you to give you guardrails to an information needed. I think there will be a lot more pressure of even more things going in-house. We've seen this trend now for a few decades. I think this will accelerate. I completely agree with you. Just curious from your point of view, because you mentioned risk a couple of times. What do you think legal teams are over-indexing and under-indexing? What is it that they think is a risk, is really not a risk, and really not appreciating some risks that are rising? What does that risk landscape change? Do you have a sense of where we are over-indexing and under-indexing?
So I would expect that when we look at regulated industries versus unregulated industries, We may be under indexing in terms of how we are serving our clients in regulated industries, in financial and health services. What's happening with that critical information and what are the risks? We're probably under indexing on cybersecurity risk because those risks are changing every day. And with artificial intelligence, those risks are increasing. We're probably over indexing on areas like contract risk. I think we all need to accept that contract management, as we once thought of it, is changing dramatically. We're going to have the capability to do contracts much faster through intake, through redlining, through storage. We're going to get more of a single source of truth, and we're going to be able to get information in a faster way. But we need to not worry as much about what that future state looks like. And people like to hold on to the things that they know they do really well and learn how to use the tools to do what we do really well faster.
Yeah, and maybe the final question before we go into a real goodbye. I do a few goodbyes before real goodbyes, as you can tell, especially if I like you, which I clearly do. If you were to design a legal team today, which would be different from what you did in the past, what would be different? What are the sort of the list of things that you would do differently today?
So today, for instance, legal operations has become a critical part of how we run the legal team. And legal operations didn't exist when I started practicing. And I still talk to teams where I'm surprised that there's no focused legal operations. When you look at the capabilities of what can happen in legal operations, it's about your technology stack. It's about enabling your team to run faster. It's about getting the information and the data that a chief legal officer like me needs to be able to report to our senior leadership and the board. What are the metrics? We started metrics once upon a time, and it was cascading, and people started tracking all sorts of things that didn't actually tell us how productive we are or where our risks are or what's happening in the market. The outside in view matters a lot more in legal operations, as well as our leaders in the team can get that. My first question to the team is consistently, what is everybody else doing? Yes, we're innovators. Yes, we are creative. Yes, we're trying to solution everything that's happening in-house. But we don't need to go to outside counsel today to ask how to do that. We need to talk to our peers who are doing it really well. And there's always somebody out there that's doing something better than what we're doing today. And as you grow and scale, which is what companies want to do, you have to figure out, how do I get from here to there faster?
Yeah, I love the way you think. Thank you for sharing that. Carolyn, we can go for a long time, but unfortunately, we do have to say goodbye. And as a part of goodbye, I want to thank you. Thank you so much for being here, sharing your wisdom, your years of experience. And thank you for being a fearless leader that been leading many in-house legal teams and global companies. I really love our conversations and always learn from you. And my ask is that maybe you can share one takeaway the audience can take from this conversation in this very turbulent and hopefully still optimistic age.
One, thank you again for having me. I love following you. And I think going back to that benchmark, the information that you share with your audience is so important because we're ultimately learning from what everybody else is doing and picking out those golden nuggets. I guess I'd leave with two golden nuggets. One is be curious. I think the more curious you are as a leader, as an individual contributor or a manager, the more you think about what is potentially a better way to do this versus I know how to do it this way, so I'm going to keep doing it the best way that I know how. Be open to that change. Be curious and know that it's not something that you should take personally because everything is changing and we need to change with it. And the second thing is ask for feedback. So if you're curious and you ask for feedback, you're going to be on the cutting edge of what you do.
Oh, I love that. What a great message. Again, Carolyn, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Always fun.
And thank you very much, audience, for sticking with us. And toward the end of the conversation, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for stopping by. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Notes to My Legal Self. Know someone who'd make a great guest? Let us know. Self-nominations are encouraged. They are an act of courage. Remember, the future of law is bright. Enjoy your in-house practice. It's an adventure of a lifetime. See you soon.